Thank you, Thomas, for that really good talk. It was really interesting. My talk is going to delve a bit more into the kind of when you're in the room with the kid. So when you're actually sitting with them and trying to actually get them to do things, which anyone who knows children or has children or has been around a child at any point knows that that can be somewhat challenging at times. So it's some of the things to think about. And I suppose it's a bit of a pointer as to what you might do if you were called upon to research with children. The caveat being that I wouldn't advise anyone to go straight into research with children. If you're not an experienced researcher or you don't have a lot of experience with children, it's always good to have someone to show you the way a little bit. Maybe watch someone, observe someone for a while before delving right in, because it's one of the harder ones, I would say. Fun, interesting, very, very engaging, very lively, but also quite tiring. Can everyone see my screen? I think they can. I'm taking no response as a good response. So I might just introduce me a little bit. My name is Frances Brown. I studied applied psychology and I had a particular interest in developmental psychology. And as part of my degree, I studied dyslexia and attitude to children with disabilities. And then I carried out academic research into Down syndrome, autism, specific language impairment, and other disabilities as well before training as a primary teacher. So that I have a lot of experience of working with children in a lot of contexts, which was very helpful then when I went to do user research with them, because just having a bit of experience allows you to be a little less afraid of it and to adapt your skills a bit more to that situation. I taught children with autism and severe to profound disabilities before moving into design research 10 years ago. So that was a bit of a change, but it's always good to take those skills and work with kids, and kids are a lovely group to work with. To explain what I do now, I run Nightingale Design Research here in Beeston. We're a small design research consultancy and we work with public and private sector, established companies, startups. Our clients include Lego, which we worked with a few years ago, NHS England, Pensions Regulator, Department for Education, and Innovate UK-funded startups. So we don't just work with children. In fact, we mostly work with adults. But my extensive experience with children and my experience of actually carrying out user research with children is what informs this talk. So working with children, and Thomas touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to delve into it a bit more about how you engage with a child. And I suppose I'm thinking of that one-to-one research where you're in a room with the child. You either have a bunch of Lego on the table, or you're testing an app, or you're testing content with children, which happens sometimes in education. You're trying to test whether they can understand a piece of content or whether it's good for their education. And I suppose the thing to start with, and again, Thomas touched on this bit, is that there's a huge difference between a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old. So there's very little difference between a 30-year-old and a 34-year-old. Generally, their life situation might be different, but generally you would expect their abilities and their skills to be quite similar. A 6-year-old and a 10-year-old, there can be a massive difference between what they can do, what they're interested in, their level of skill, their language, their reading ability, all of those things. And so everything has to be adapted to the particular needs of the child you're working with. And if you're working across ages, you have to be quite agile and quite able to just roll with the punches. As soon as something happens, you have to be able to adapt. And that's what makes people who work with children very good researchers, I think, because it makes you think on your feet. You can't assume a child can read. And I think Thomas's video illustrated that very well. Children might think they can read. They might be able to read at a certain level. They might be able to read, but not very consistently. And they might not always understand what you're saying either. So you might say something to them, they might nod, they might smile, they might even answer you, but they might not actually understand a word that you're saying. And so you have to be careful not to take it at face value that a child really gets what you're saying to them. You have to be careful to check that they know what you're talking about. And you have to modify your approach on the fly. So if you have an approach and then suddenly you find this child's really not getting it, then you have to be able to adapt at that point. And I suppose a key thing there is that you have to be aware of how you're influencing the interaction through your approach, your language, the power dynamics, how you're interpreting things. That's true of any piece of research, but it's especially true with children because of the fact that you're older than they are. you're an authority figure, they don't know who you are, it's a slightly strange situation. And so you have to be very conscious that you're not influencing the situation too much, or that the child isn't just trying to please you or isn't just answering because they feel that's what they have to do. A key part of working with children, as it is with adults, but obviously it's more complex with children, is safeguarding. So all researchers who work with children in the UK should be DBS checked. That's as standard if you're working with children. The NSPCC has tools and courses and advice to ensure you have appropriate safeguarding in place, and whoever's organising the research should have all this thought through anyway, but it's worth mentioning. Ethics is the same as for adults, so whatever approach you might take with adults, you would take with children, with the added caveat that parents are consenting on behalf of the child usually. And usually that isn't a problem, but sometimes they're signed up to the research when they're not really that keen on it because their parents want them to participate. And so you have to be aware that they're not always going to be that enthusiastic if someone else has consented on their behalf. If you're ever unsure, you stop the session and you write down your concerns. The reason I would say you write them down, if that's something that's kind of a hangover from my safeguarding for teaching, is that you potentially need to be able to tell someone else what a child has told you or what has happened. And so having something written down just helps you. Just to say, this is a very unlikely scenario as well. So because children who participate in research generally won't have issues that are going to come up during the session. But if it does, you talk to the parents if that's appropriate. And if not, you source outside help. The NSPCC is a very good source of help. In extremes, you might call the police, but let's not go there. It's not very, very rare that would ever happen. Power dynamics, which I mentioned earlier. Just put yourself in the place of a child. It's very unusual for an adult to come along to a child and say, hey, I would like to know your opinion on this interesting and serious thing, especially if it's not a relative of theirs or a teacher. You're a slightly random person as a researcher. You're an adult. Why do you care about what I think is what the child sometimes thinks? And so you have to set the scene very carefully for them so that they understand what that interaction is. It's very unfamiliar. That's true as well often for adults. So if you're used to researching with adults, you just have to adapt that for children in a slightly more explicit way where you explain everything that's going on. In general, children will feel pleased and excited to be involved in research because it's something unusual, something different. They might be getting an incentive. So for the Lego research, we gave them a little box of Lego, which is always very good. Children love that. But they can take a bit of time to warm up. So you have to give them a bit of time to get used to the situation, not overwhelm them too quickly. And it's very important to be aware of how comfortable the child is and to take into account that they won't always be able to say if they're not happy. So they don't always know, okay, I can stop this situation or I can just leave if I want to, because they're used to a school situation or other situations where they don't necessarily have that much control. Energy and focus are a big part of the situation. So some children are very energetic and chatty. We all know the energetic and chatty children of the world. Others are more reserved and quiet. And the energy of the session needs to be brought to a stable middle. So if a child's very energetic, you might need to bring their energy down a little bit. If they're a little bit quiet and reserved, you might need to bring them up a little bit. And it's important, and I think it's something you learn over time, to sort of match their energy and then bring it to the level that you need it to be and try and hold it there, which is quite tiring and can take a lot of effort if a child is either very, very energetic or quite reserved and quiet. And small talk is vital, and I've kind of put it in a small talk, but really it's an important part at the start of the session because you're assessing the child's language skills and you're making them comfortable. And what I mean by assessing their skills is going back to what I was saying earlier about the differences between children of different ages. You want to have a quick chat with them to see, are they making eye contact with me? So are they comfortable? Are they engaged? Are they answering me in full sentences? Do they say things that are quite detailed and articulate and are using lots of words? Or is it yes, no, not responding? And so you're always thinking all the time, where is this child at? How do I have to start this session? Maybe I need to change a few things. Maybe I need to give them a few more minutes to warm up. Maybe they seem a little bit not very engaged. Maybe I need to dampen the enthusiasm a little bit. Whatever it is, you're using that first bit of the session to set the scene, give them a bit of a chance to settle in and see where they are. School, toys, siblings are good conversation topics, but being aware that a child may tell you things that an adult wouldn't. Not necessarily anything very difficult, but that their dog died recently or that their parents are splitting up, which can be a difficult topic. And so you have to be aware that you can't just gloss over what a child says to you. You have to then engage with them on that topic and have the ability then to discuss that with them and then move it on to the session or deal with it if there is an issue there. And staying on task can be a challenge, especially if a child has an interest that they really want to tell you about. And this is the thing with Lego, that a lot of children are quite interested in Lego if they are Lego fans. And so they want to tell you about their latest Lego purchase, and they want to tell you about what they built and where they went and what they did. And so you have to strike a balance between being friendly and approachable and chatty, and then bringing the child back on task, because you are there to do something. You're not there to chat for 20 minutes about the next Lego figure that they would love to buy. So designing research. One key part of designing the research is the timing and the location. So when the research is carried out is important, because after school, children are often tired and hungry, and they might not be in the right frame of mind. Especially a younger child, a tired child can be just one who's just not going to listen to you. They're not interested. Weekends and school holidays might be better, but obviously that restricts when you can carry out the research. In terms of location, home is a safe space, but it can be too relaxed. So I found a lot of the research I did, academic research, I would go to the children's houses. It was great because it was very safe and they felt very comfortable, but then you might have a dog coming in from outside. You might have a sibling who's interested in what's going on. You might have mom or dad offering you cups of tea, which is nice of them, but it's a bit disruptive. So it's not always the right situation, depending on what kind of research you're carrying out. Offices can be intimidating. The Lego offices in London were not intimidating. They had a penguin and a Lego penguin and a Lego Harry Potter and a Lego phone booth, which one of the other researchers went into and broke. And it was, really exciting, and the kids were amazed to be there. Just being aware, of course, that can influence their reactions as well, because it's a wondrous experience, so they can be a little bit overwhelmed by it. School is a great place to carry out research. I did most of my academic research in schools, and the reason it was good there was because the type of research we were doing was quite focused and academic based. And kids are used to doing work at school. They're used to sitting down. They're used to focusing. You have their TA or their teacher there to tell you things that you need to, but they're not their parents, so they're not going to necessarily get involved. And you have a desk to work at, which a nice clear space. So different locations can be better than others. And be nice to parents. You're depending on parents if you want children to take part in your research. And there might be other siblings that they need to deal with. So you need to allow those siblings to come along as well. You can't necessarily expect parents to find childcare for other children in the family. And you may need to provide a space for them to play and some toys for them to play with, which they'll be happy with because there'll be other children there for them to play with. And then you need to provide a smaller incentive for siblings as well, because as all parents know, nothing causes a screaming fit more reliably than the other child getting something and them not getting anything. Doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing, but it needs to be something. And as with all research, the suitability of the method depends on what you're researching and trying to find out. So you might have a situation where you're watching children play. You might have a very focused and academic type setup where you're sitting at a desk with children. But you must consider how the method might affect their ability to engage. So you have to think of all the variables, and much more so than adults, because adults will come into a situation and take note of the situation and adapt to it, whereas children won't always respond to the situation unless you set it up very explicitly to manage their expectations and to make sure there's not a lot of distractions or not a lot of opportunities for them to move outside of the task that you're doing. And good screening is very important. I mean, as with any research, you need to understand who it is you're trying to work with, think of any factors or variables that might affect the research and might make certain participants less suitable or more suitable than others. That goes back a bit to what Thomas was saying about maybe looking at the extremes of different age groups or people that you want to focus on, and then understanding what it is you're trying to get out. But I think the key things are that you can't assume any level of knowledge or experience with children. So some children don't watch TV, for example, so you can't assume that they watch TV. Don't ask a question about it until you know that they actually do watch TV. Or like my children, they watch YouTube and they don't have a clue how actual broadcast TV works. Or they don't know how a phone works. So like a desktop phone, you know what I mean? And you have to be aware that, anything that you ask them, they might not understand what you're saying. So they might not have enough experience to understand what it is that you're talking about. This bar is in my way and I can't get it out of my way. So I can't actually see that. But anyway, be aware of any physical or cognitive barriers that the child might have, including disabilities, visible and invisible. And again, screening comes into that because you might want to know anything about the child that might affect their ability to engage. It's not necessarily the case that if a child has a disability, they can't engage. You just have to be aware of it, and you have to factor it in and have your setup ready to go for whatever that child needs. Starting the session, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier about using small talk. So you need to use small talk at the start of the session to quickly determine the level of energy and engagement the child has, their language level, their interest in the area that you're researching. I was researching with a child at one point, and he seemed a little bit grumpy and a bit off and a bit unresponsive, and we kind of soldiered on a little bit, and then I said, "Is everything okay?" And he said, "Oh, I just don't really like this." And I felt quite sorry for him, and I think his parents signed him up for the research, and they really shouldn't have. And he felt a bit out of place, and so I said, "We don't need to carry on." He said, "No, we'll do it, and we'll carry on." And we managed to get through the session, but I felt bad for him that he was trying to make it work when he really wasn't that bothered and wasn't that interested. And children will sometimes try to please you, and then other times they won't go along with something that they don't have an interest in. So you just have to be aware that you're not upsetting them, or that they're not trying to get through the session. Remember, and this sounds like a really kind of basic thing to remember, but I think if you're an adult, or you always work with adults and you've never worked with children, you need to tell a child that they can go to the toilet, because children are used to school where they have to ask, and they don't always know how to ask, because sometimes in schools, when I was a primary teacher, some schools have it so that they have to put both their hands up if they want to go to the toilet. That's how they signal. And so they're in a new situation. They know you don't know that. They don't know how to ask. And so you have to say, the toilet's just out there. If you need to go, all you have to do is get up, and you can ask me if you want, or you can just leave. You might need to assure a younger child that mom or dad is just there. They're outside. Generally, it's not a good idea to have the parent in the room for various reasons, but it can be better to have the parent in the room if the child's not comfortable not having them there. You might want to give the child a drink, but just bearing in mind how often children spill things, you have to be careful not to leave it in their reach, or in their, within reach of whatever it is that you're working on. You might put it a little to the left and say, "There's just a glass of water there, or just a bottle of water there. You can take water whenever you like," but then put it back out of the way so you don't avoid disasters if you can. And you have to set the scene as clearly as you can for the child, because they might just not really understand what's going on. So if there's a lot going on in the session, it's a case of not overwhelming them too much at the start with all of the details of what you're doing, but just very clearly saying, "I'm interested to know what you think of this. We're going to have a little play with it. I'd love you to tell me what you think. Anytime you do something or change something, I'd love you to tell me what you did. And if you have anything you want to say about it, go ahead and tell me, and I'll have some questions to ask." And then at every point, just check their understanding. Is that okay? Do you get that? Is there anything you want to ask me? And keep reassuring the child that they're doing a good job, and that if there's any issues, you'll help them. Questions and prompts are important, as they are with any research, and the research materials have to be designed to suit all the age groups that you're working with. They can't be too complicated and they can't be too babyish. And I think either is bad, because kids who are older really don't like to engage in a testing session that seems to be for younger children. They might play along and they might be a good sport about it, but they might find it a little bit insulting to be playing with something or doing something that seems a little bit too easy for them. You need to be prepared to adapt quickly to each individual participant. So if you find this child's really not understanding what I'm saying, then you need to change it up really quickly, find another way of expressing what you're asking. So, before you actually start the research, it's important to identify points where children might not understand. So again, I suppose relevant to the research that Thomas was talking about, do you ever play on a tablet? Is something you might ask the child if you're doing something on a tablet. But the child might answer no because they call it an iPad. That's something I come across a lot, because lots of children don't call it a tablet. And I called it a tablet a few times in a session, and the child was obviously able to use the tablet. So I was like, what's going on? I don't get it. And then she said, oh, I have an iPad. I was like, oh, okay. I didn't connect up those two. So instead, you might ask, and I did in later sessions, say, do you ever play on one of these? And then listen to what the child calls it. And try not to put words into the child's mouth, especially for things that are important. And children can be quite literal. So if you ask them if they own a tablet, they might say no because they share it with their sibling. They want to own it, but they don't. They share it with somebody else, and it's a point of contention. So you have to be careful if it is an important question. I mean, owning or sharing a tablet might not be that important. But if it's an important question, you might have to come at it from a few different angles just to make sure that the child understands it. And one thing, I suppose, that is quite universal across children, although it does change with age, is time. Children really have a very poor grasp of time. So if you need to ask them how often they do a thing, or when do they do a thing, or how many times have they done a thing, first, I would say that's a difficult question to get an accurate answer to. But if you are doing it, you have to be very specific and ask them a very concrete question. Last Monday, did you do this? On Tuesday, did you do it? On Wednesday, did you do it? On Thursday, did you do it? To get how often they're doing it across a week, for example. And because otherwise, if you say how often, they say, oh, sometimes. What does that mean? To a child, it could mean anything. Adults are much more time oriented. Children have parents to take care of that for them, lucky them. And another key part of that is prompting versus helping versus stopping. So a child might approach a task very slowly, or they might do it without much concentration. They might look like they're not really thinking, or they're not really engaging. And it can be tempting to jump in quickly and move them forward and try and get an answer out of them. And you might also be worried, oh, I'm going to lose control of the situation, or I'm going to, they're becoming disengaged. But you can really bias the results. You can, I've seen research happening where the researcher was so quick to jump in with prompts that essentially she answered all the questions, and the data was really poor from the session. And so we had to, remind her, please, don't speak, allow the child to answer or not answer. Give a very minor prompt or something that is getting them to say what the thing is, but don't put the words in their mouth, because you can't then assume that that's what they would have said. It can also frustrate the child or make them feel rushed if you're trying to push them along. And deciding when to prompt and when to step in and help and when to just stop the session, it takes careful judgment. And the main thing is not to upset the child. I mean, no research is worth having a situation where the child just can't do the thing and is getting upset and is getting frustrated. If they're finding it frustrating, just let it go and stop. And you need to judge the level of encouragement the child needs. So some children respond really well to you saying, great, that's very good, on to the next thing. That's great. Can you show me the next thing? Well done. And lots of verbal encouragement and lots of feedback. And some children, especially older children, find that a little bit patronizing. And they're quite happy for you to make very little comment. And all you need to say is, thanks, that was great at the end of it, and let it go there. So it's a judgment call there, as well as to what the child might need in that situation. pitfalls to avoid, I suppose the main thing with children, and I kind of alluded to it there, is that you'll end up with messy data that's really difficult to interpret because of a number of things, which firstly, it's vague questions or questions children can't answer. And I suppose coming back to that time thing, how often do you play with your tablet, for example? A 6-year-old definitely can't give you anything reliable on that one. They could say every day, but then you find out, if you ask them more questions, you find out that there are brownies on a Monday, they have gymnastics on a Tuesday, they go to their grannies on a Wednesday. So that's not every day, is it? They're gone doing things every day. So they would like to use it every day, but they don't use it every day. So it's being quite specific and quite concrete and getting some real examples of things that you want to find out, rather than relying on children having concepts that they don't necessarily have. Over prompting, which I just referred to there, so putting words into the child's mouth and then assuming that they have said it, or they're just agreeing with you because you keep talking, so they just go yeah, because they don't know what else to say. Over interpreting responses, so a child says something a bit vague and then you build on it even though that's not what they mean, so you're not really listening to what they're saying, or you're not hearing what they're saying. And overloading the session so that the child becomes tired and frustrated. And I suppose the reason why researching with children is a good way to become a good researcher is because it makes you really, really focus on what it is that you're trying to find out. It makes you take away a lot of the fat and the fluff, because a child, especially like a 6 or 7-year-old, won't tolerate a session that goes on for a whole hour where it's very intense and you're asking lots of questions. You need to really focus on, what is it I really need to find out? What are the key things that are needed from this research, and try and get those things, and then other details are a bonus. And it allows you to have that kind of adaptability when something goes wrong or the child clearly doesn't understand you, to then think, okay, how am I going to change this up so that I get more at what that child can do? And to wrap it up, the key points are that you can't assume anything about your participants. You can't assume that they've ever ridden a bike. You can't assume that they can swim. You can't assume that they've ever watched a TV. You can't assume that they can read. You can't assume that they're going to understand any of the words that you're saying. And so it means you have to be very adaptable, but you also have to focus really tightly on what it is you're trying to find out. And there isn't a lot of wiggle room there to just chance your arm. You have to be quite clear on what it is you're trying to find out, so that if your approach isn't working for this particular child, you know a different way to get at it, and you know a different way to find out what you need to find out. You use the first few sessions or first few minutes of the session to assess the child, their language, their demeanour, their engagement, and then you adapt it according to what they need. You read their body language, and you have to be careful to watch if a child seems to be getting frustrated, uncomfortable, upset because they don't know what you're saying, or if they're really enjoying the session and they're getting excited and they're starting to get a bit more energetic than you need them to be. So maybe giving them a moment to calm down. And if there are very important questions, or if there are key things that you're trying to find out, then it is important, especially with younger children, to approach that question from multiple angles, just to make sure that the child has understood you, they have actually answered your question, and the data you've gotten is actually genuine, and you've not just made something up, or they've not just agreed with you because that they thought that's what you wanted to hear. And that's it.